Brent, this has really been a great project. Tell everybody a little bit about this car.
Well, what we got here is a 1956 Chevrolet Model 150. Started life, when we got it, it was a rolling chassis, no engine. Needed quite a bit of body work. As you can see, we did some of that. And part of the DVD today, we're actually going to show you how we got to this point.
Also have an engine here.
Yep, we also have the engine. We're going to finish the engine assembly, get it to the point where we can actually mock it up. We're going to put some new motor mounts in the car, side mounts instead of the front mounts that originally came with this vehicle.
So upcoming here, we've got exterior work. I want to show you that body work. We've got engine assembly.
Yep.
Additionally, we've got some interior work that we want to show you and give you some great tips and tricks to get stuff going to make the inside of the car as pretty as the outside of the car. You ready to get to work?
I'm ready.
Let's hit it. This 56 Chev is really looking great, but it didn't look so great the very first time it rolled into this building. So Brent, give us a little bit of the overview. You were the one to find the car, you were the one to get it here. So how'd she look from day one?
It was pretty rough. I mean, the body was fairly solid. It was a rolling chassis, 1956 150. The body was fairly solid. It had been restored sometime in the early 80s, judging by the paint and the pinstripe that was on there. It still needed some work. I mean, some of the body work needed to be redone, which we got the main body done. We're going to show a little bit later, we're going to show how we got to this point. But the interior is fairly solid. I mean, the floors are fairly solid. The rockers had been replaced, like I say, in the 80s.
And one of the things that was great news was the complex glass was all intact.
Yep, the
Some
windshield.
of the flat glass had to be replaced, right?
Yeah, the windshield and the back glass was all in good shape. The two side windows were cracked. I had a local glass guy make those for, I think they were $100 for both of them. So, I mean, it was fairly inexpensive to replace the glass. And all the chrome was there. That's a big thing too when you start looking at these older cars. If the chrome in the glass is bad, you can tie up a lot of money in chrome and glass.
Now, as the work started, Brent established a goal early in the game, which was to make this not a show car, but a daily driver,
Right,
something that
right.
you wouldn't be afraid to just drive to the grocery store. And what are some of the forks in the road that created on the decision-making process?
Well, a lot of this stuff, I mean, when you get to building the engine, I mean, if you're going to do a show car, you could build a high horsepower engine because you're not planning on driving it on the street. It doesn't matter what you have to put in for gas. Any of the body work, you might instead of welding in a complete quarter section, you might just weld in a patch over the area that's affected rather than replacing the whole quarter section. There's just a lot of little things to try and keep the costs down because you're going to drive it. You're not trying to win points with it. You're not trying to win car shows with it. Just to be able to use it to make it justifiable. You tie $100,000 up into this car, you don't want to drive it. So you just got to try and keep the cost down.
And as we turn the clock back and people are out there looking for their own rolling stock, any buying advice for them on what kind of things to shop for, what kind of things to stay away from?
Well, like I said before, glass and chrome are very important.
Because they're hard to replace.
Yep, they are. Now, the nice thing with the Tri-5 Chevys, if that's what you're looking for, you can get anything. It gets expensive, you know. I mean, like the taillights, I just looked at those. They're almost $500 for a set of taillights. But you can replace it. But you know, you get into some of these oddball cars, like a Packard or a Studebaker or something like that, where they don't make replacement parts anymore. Make sure all those parts are there before you start, go and buy it. And if you don't know cars, have somebody that does know cars look at it. Crawl underneath and look at it, and know that you're going to have to fabricate some parts.
So it's basic advice would be stick with a mainstream vehicle on your first go-around, maybe.
Yes.
And then, of course, it's just intuitive. The more that's intact when you get started, the less work you're going to have to do. That's a good overview of where we started with the body on this car, and kind of shows you where we've been and talks a little bit about where we're going. Brent, are we going to the gym?
Yep, we're going to go do some body work.
Excellent. See you later. No, what we really want to talk about is how you can get your vehicle from as ugly as this door is here to as pretty as that quarter panel is that's all done on the car. Brent, you got some great stuff. Let's first give people a reality check.
Okay.
If they want to do this, what do they got to be prepared to do?
In order to go from this to that, there's a lot of steps involved. You're going to need some tools. You're going to need a well-ventilated area. You're going to need some protective clothing. It gets a little, the dust flies, the paint fumes. You have to be prepared to do this. Now, here's one of those forks in the road that if you want it done professionally, you could absolutely hire somebody, a body shop or whatever,
Turn the
to do
whole
it.
thing over to somebody
Turn the
else.
whole thing over to somebody else. But if you can do it yourself, just be prepared. It's not it's a lot of work. I mean, there's a lot of work to it. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to take this door outside, and we're going to actually strip the old paint off.
Now, why do I got to take all the paint off? Why can't I just overlay what I got?
Right here, you can see the original color is the paint, and I know back in the 50s they used lacquer. Okay, if you use lacquer and you put a catalyzed paint over the top of lacquer, if you ever have to repair that area again, the lacquer will actually swell up and it'll crack that, and you'll never be able to get rid of that lift area. So you have to actually, if you know there's lacquer under there, you have to strip this thing down completely.
And when in doubt,
to be safe.
Sand it out.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
So what we're going to do is we're going to strip this door off, and there's, a lot of different ways you could strip it off. A DA is probably the most common way.
So an air-driven, grab that sander so
Yep.
everybody knows what we're talking
So
about.
this is a DA, dual action sander, and I mean, you hook it to the air compressor and you just keep working it until all the paint is gone, and then use typically like an 80 grit sandpaper to strip paint off. You could send it out and have it media blasted. They use baking soda, they use corn cobs, they use all kinds of different things to actually strip the paint off. You don't want to
big scale, not just the door. I mean, remember, we're talking about the whole vehicle.
Right, you could take the whole vehicle and send it out and have it media blasted. You don't want to use sandblasting because sandblasting actually creates so much heat that it can warp the metal. So you got to be really careful with sandblasting. What I found is a 4.5 inch angle grinder with these abrasive wheels. They just look like a plastic spider web. And they strip the paint off very fast. They leave a nice clean finish. Just all we have to do
No overheating.
Nope,
So
doesn't overheat.
You're not melting the paint, you're taking it off.
Right, you're actually stripping it off, and it goes really, really, really quickly. So that's the first step, is to get the paint off. Then we're going to actually clean it off good. This one doesn't need any masking because the glass has been removed and all the chrome has been removed. And that's another one of those forks in the road. If you just want to sand this thing and make it look better, you don't need to pull the chrome off. You can mask the chrome off. But this one we wanted to do a little better job. We wanted to get all the paint off, so we actually stripped everything off.
One of the things can be dicey. Sometimes the chrome looks great right up until the point where you try to remove it from the vehicle.
Yeah.
So sometimes working around it and masking it off is a better solution if you're not 100% sure you can get it off and get it back on intact.
Right. So we'll get this thing down, clean it up, strip the paint off, clean it, and then we're going to put some primer on it. And the primer that I've been using for years is called Tenneco, and if you can find it, I highly, highly recommend it. It's a high build, 2-part epoxy primer. It'll fill 80 grit sand scratches with 3 full coats. Three good coats of primer will fill 80 grit sand scratches. And the coarser sandpaper you can use when we get to doing the body work, we have to fix one little dent in there, so we're going to have to do some body work on it. The coarser sandpaper, the straighter it's going to be. So then we're going to prime it. After we do the body work, get the body work straight, we'll prime it, and then we'll actually block sand the primer out, and then put the finish coat on, and then put the clear coat on.
And they're going to see all of that happen to this very door. We're opening the door on Bodywork for our viewers.
And then all you have to do is this about 25 times over, and you paint the whole
one
car.
of those. Yeah. All right, so overview there, but we're going to get right down to the nitty gritty with Brent's very own tips and tricks to make sure that you're just as good at doing this as Brent is with a little bit of practice.
Well, we moved the door outside into a little better ventilated area, so we're going to get started on stripping the old paint off, find out exactly what's underneath it. Before we do, though, got to gear up a little bit. I'm going to have to put a face mask on, keep the dust, breathe in the dust, safety glasses, and hearing protection. So when I get this stuff on, you aren't going to be able to hear me anymore. But I'm going to get started on this door, and we'll see what we can find. Okay, so we got the door stripped. Everything that I can do, at least with the angle grinder, I'm going to have to grab a little hand sand, do a little hand sanding up around the trim and stuff. I did find a little bit of plastic filler from the last restoration here, which we didn't know it was there until we started stripping the paint off, so we'll have to fix that. There's one little dent right about here, and then a little rust area here that we're going to need to fix. Real time, it took about 35 minutes to strip the door. And here again, do this about 20 times over, and we'll get to looking like that car does. So next, now what I'm going to do is grab a different grinder so I can rough up the areas where we have to put plastic filler in. I'll grab the plastic filler and we'll go from there. Okay, so we've got the stuff that we're going to use to actually put plastic filler on here. And plastic filler relies on mechanical adhesion, so we had to grab a different grinder so we can rough up the areas that need to be repaired. Even as rough as this looks, it's not quite rough enough for the plastic filler to bite into it and get a really good grip to it. So we're going to rough those up a little bit. I'm going to mix up some filler and put it on the 3 areas that we identified. This one here, now here again, this is one of those deals. If this wasn't a daily driver, if we were really putting this up for points car, we'd want to actually take this, cut this piece of rusted metal out here, weld in a new patch. But it's a fairly small hole. I'm just going to plastic filler over the top of it. We'll prime it and it'll last. I've got cars that are 15 years old that I've had small rust holes like that, and they're holding up just fine. So I'm going to take and grind these areas out a little bit, and then I'm going to mix up some filler and put it in those spots. All right, so now we got the areas roughed up. I'm going to mix up a little plastic filler and put it in those areas, and then we can let it set up, and once it's set up and dry, then we'll sand it out. It's pretty important to get the hardener mixed in thoroughly, so that's why obviously it's different colors. If you see any light spots in here, that's not going to harden as good as obviously the darker spots, because there's no hardener in that filler. So we get her mixed up good, and this is there's quite an art form, really. It takes practice to get plastic filler to go where you want it and lay it down nice. So be patient with it. It just takes a little bit of time. And normally you're going to have to put 2 coats on, but sometimes you'll get away with 1. All right, so now what we'll do is we'll let that harden up, come back, sand it off, and we'll probably have to put another skim coat on the top of it to get this thing straight the way that we want it. So we're going to let it harden up, and we'll be back. All right, so the plastic filler is set up enough to do some sanding on it, and when we were checking it out, I did find another spot that needed a little bit of attention, so we ground that out and put a little filler in there. The big thing with plastic filler is an air file. It makes life a whole lot easier. You can do it by hand, but it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. This makes the job a whole lot easier. So what I'm going to do is put my mask on. We're going to sand these down a little bit. More times than not, you're going to have to recoat. Hopefully, well, I'm sure we're going to have to recoat one of them. I could feel on this one for sure we're going to have to recoat, but more times than not, you're going to have to put 2, sometimes even 3 coats to get this thing as straight as it needs to be, so you can't see it once the paint is on. So I'm going to mask up, and we'll get this stuff sanded down. All right, well, I've got this to a point where I'm going to have to do a little recoating on it. A couple things that you need to remember when you're working with plastic fillers: always start with a real coarse grit, 36 or 40 grit. That gives you the straightest cut. And then use either an air file, a longer sanding hand block. Don't ever use a DA. You cannot keep a DA straight enough. You'll see waves in the plastic filler. So what we need to do now is clean it off, put another coat of filler on there, and then we just do the same thing until we get all these low spots, which you can see in this particular case, and some of them you actually just run your hand across there. If you can feel it, it's going to show up in your paint. So we're just going to redo the same thing we did on the first coat, and then we're going to sand again until we get this thing perfectly straight and ready for primer. We've got this thing sanded down with 36 grit now, so it's as straight as we're going to make it. The next step is to take 80 grit and sand all this filler down with a little bit of 80 grit so the primer can fill in easier. And then we're going to take and do some hand sanding around the tight spots where we couldn't quite get the grinding wheel in. And then once you get it to this point, now it's fairly important to get it into primer in a reasonable amount of time because this bare metal can flash rust. You've got some time. If it does do some flash rusting on you, you need to take a DA or take a sanding pad and just get that rust knocked off before you do the priming. But so the next step now, we're going to take 80 grit and we're going to hit all the filler, and we're going to take a little bit of sandpaper and catch around the edges, and then we'll be ready to clean it up and get priming. All right, so we've got this all sanded down now with 80 grit, and I like to use just a hand block when I'm doing 80 grit because all we're trying to do is knock down the 36 grit sand scratches to let the primer, so it doesn't have quite so much fill to build quite so much. And you want to use long flowing strokes with it because it's real easy if you spend too much time in one area. It's pretty easy to undercut that area. And then, I mean, if you run your hand across an area and you can feel a little ripple or a little bubble, I guarantee you're going to see it in the finish coat. You're not going to see it here, you're not going to see it in the primer, but once you get a real high gloss finish, you're going to see that little ripple in there. So run your hand across it all, make sure everything feels nice and smooth. Once you get to that point, we're ready to just clean it up, mask it, and do some priming. All right, so we got the outside of the door shell all ready to get cleaned up. We flipped it over and we're going to actually scuff the door jambs and shoot some primer on those before we do the outside. But first I want to mix up the primer. In years past, the epoxy primers have always had a 30-minute induction time, which simply means you mix the two parts together and you let it sit for 30 minutes before you actually can spray it. They don't say that anymore in the instructions, but I guess it's a force of habit for me to do it. I guess if you're uncomfortable with it, you can actually check up on the manufacturer's specifications, and they'll tell you exactly what you need to do for each particular product. But I'm going to mix up the primer right now, and we're going to let it sit while we're scuffing the door jambs and getting them cleaned up and ready for prime. So I'll mix that up. And to mix it, I like to use these mix cups. They're graduated. This is a PPG one. They're 4:1:2, 4:1:1. Primer in this case is a 1:1 mix. So there's somewhere on here, there's a 1:1 mix right here. So I'm just going to fill it up to number 2 and fill it up to number 2 with the second part, and then stir that up, and then we'll just set it off to the side and let it sit. So this should have been shaken before we picked it up. But you always want to stir this stuff up, both parts, just to make sure. All right, so I got part A here all mixed up now. What I'm going to do is just put some gloves on, and then rather than taking this full gallon and trying to dump just a little bit out, I've got a cup here that I'm going to scoop some out and put into my measuring cup. You still need to use a measuring cup, because you got to get part A and part B in 1:1 ratio, so you want to be pretty precise on it. But I'm just going to use a little cup here rather than trying to dump that full gallon. All right, so I've got that up to the line at number 2, which is where I want to start with it. And now I'm going to open up part B. We'll stir that up. Using a different cup, we'll scoop some out of there and fill this up to line 2 on the second one to give me a 1:1 ratio. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to dip some out of there with a clean cup. Make sure you don't mix these two things together, because it will actually start to harden in the can. And then when you do open these cans up, you don't want to be in a little 8x8 closet with no ventilation. You want to be somewhere where the wind's blowing. And when we start spraying, for sure, we're going to have a respirator, we're going to have a spray suit on, we're going to have a sock, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we actually start spraying. But I'm going to get this mixed up so we can set it off to the side and get scuffing on that. All right, now we're ready to do some scuffing on the door jamb. So to do that, just going to use a regular Scotch-Brite red scuff pad. I like to tear them in half. Makes them a little easier to hold on to. And then there's nothing more than just just rubbing it, scuffing it down until it's not shiny anymore. That's enough of a mechanical adhesion for the primer to bite into. And we're not worried about stripping the inside of the door jamb here, because if you do get into an accident, if the inside of the door jamb is damaged, chances are you're going to have to replace the door anyway. If you do get a little lift inside the door jamb, nobody's ever going to see it. So we'll get this scuffed up, and then we can clean it up and shoot some primer. All right, so the door jambs are scuffed. As you can see, there's a little bit of flash rust in here, just a little surface rust. As we clean this up, that primer that we use, that tentacle primer, that'll hold that at bay for years and years and years. If you were building a show car, points car, you might want to take and sandblast all that before you actually primed. But we're just building a driver. It'll hold, like I say, it'll hold for many, many years. So I'm going to grab some wax and grease remover, put some gloves on, and actually wipe these down and get it ready to prime. Some guys will use paint thinner. Wax and grease remover is specifically designed to actually float the materials up to the top, so when you wipe it with a clean rag, it actually pulls the materials off. Paint thinner will actually just kind of smear it around. It won't actually float it to the top. So get a rag good and wet. And you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. You want to wipe it off as it's still wet. If it dries, then it's too late. You got to re-soak it again, because what you're trying to do is pick up all these foreign contaminants. All right, so the door jamb's all scuffed, it's cleaned. I'm going to grab some masking tape and we'll just mask up the striker, and then there's a little piece of chrome in here that needs to be masked off, and then we're ready to shoot some primer on the door jamb. All right, the jam's ready to prime, so what I'm going to do is go get my Tyvek suit on, spray sock, and a respirator. By that time, the primer will have sat long enough. We'll stir it up good again, and then we'll reduce it down so it sprays better. And then we're ready to shoot some primer. All right, I got my Tyvek suit on, my spray sock, and my respirator. The reason you wear this Tyvek suit is twofold. Number one, the majority of the dirt that gets into paint jobs comes off the painter themselves. So if you wear a suit over your street clothes, it keeps the paint job a lot cleaner. Two is for safety. I mean, this is some pretty nasty stuff we're spraying. Isocyanates, it's obviously a serious concern, cancer-causing agents. So you want to protect yourself as best you can. So I'm suited up, ready. I did add a little bit of thinner to the epoxy just to make it spray a little bit better. It's ready to go. I'm gonna go ahead and put my respirator on, and then we're gonna shoot the door jamb. All right, so we got a coat of primer on here, and because we're not going to sand the inside of the door jambs, one coat is enough. All we're trying to do is just seal this so we get a consistent color between the front and the back. This is ready. Now we'll let it dry for just a little bit. We'll flip the door over. We'll clean it up with wax and grease remover on the outside of it, and we'll shoot 3 full wet coats on the outside because we're actually going to block sand this out when it's dry. So we're going to let this dry for a little bit, and then we'll be right back. All right, the primer's dry on the jambs. We flipped it over. We cleaned off the outside of the door with wax and grease remover, and we're ready to spray. One thing I failed to mention before when we were mixing up the primer is anytime you use this 2-part epoxy or 2-part paints, primers, anything, you want to make sure you only mix up as much as you're going to use because it does have a shelf life, it does have a pot life. I would guess this primer is probably 5 or 6 hours, and it'll actually start to harden in the cup itself. So you want to be careful. You want to only mix up what you're going to use. And this is actually ready to spray. It's all masked, it's all cleaned. So I'm going to go ahead and spray the first coat of primer on here. All right, we got the first coat of primer on here. We're going to have to let this flash off a little bit and let it dry for maybe 10 minutes. And then we'll go ahead and put a second coat on there. Then we'll let that dry, put a third coat on there, and then at that point we'll be ready. Let it sit overnight. We'll come back and we'll block sand it in the morning and be ready for color. All right, so George and I have been sanding on this for about an hour. And the key to any paint job is the prep work. The more time you take getting this thing perfectly smooth, perfectly straight, the better your paint job's gonna look. And I can't stress enough how important it is to actually block sand this. Don't use a DA on it. You can see those things a mile away. They look shimmery almost. The undercoat does, the base coat does. So you gotta use a block sander. You gotta put the time in if you want this thing to look nice, straight, and true. So what we're looking for is a uniform color. With this particular primer, it gets lighter as you sand it. So it starts this dark color here, and as you sand it, you get this light color. So as we're sanding this thing, we're looking for the sand scratch, swells, any kind of imperfections that black color will show up in, or that darker color will show up in. And we just use a regular, well, it's just a squeegee that you get at the paint store. And right here, I don't know if we have a good camera angle on this, but you can see there's dark spots right here. So there's a little sand scratch swells right here that we're gonna have to just keep sanding until all that gets to this uniform color. So I'm gonna keep sanding on it, and we'll get this thing all prettied up and get ready for a base coat. So as we're getting closer, what we're using to block sand this is 400 wet dry paper on just a regular rubber sanding block. When we get into the contoured areas here, we got sanding sponges that don't actually have sandpaper on them. You have to wrap the 400 grit around them. There's firmer ones, there's softer ones to get into these curved areas, and I'll be using those a little bit later on that. But for now, I'm going to finish this up. And it's important if you break through anywhere where you actually sand through back to bare metal, you need to actually put a quick coat of sealer on here. If you don't break through, this is a perfectly good base for the paint. Now I'm going to switch over to that sponge. I'm going to get the curved areas here. And again, what I'm looking for when I squeegee is just dark spots where it looks like a sanding mark or it looks like just an imperfection of some sort. All right, well, I did break through in a couple spots here on this edge, so I got bare metal showing. So we're gonna have to put a quick coat of sealer on this here, but this is definitely not the time to start cutting corners because you gotta have this base coat on here, you gotta have good primer against the metal. Otherwise, the paint is just gonna bubble up. You gotta have a good epoxy primer against the metal. So what I'm gonna do is get this cleaned up the rest of the way, and then we'll shoot a quick coat of sealer on there, and it'll be ready to flip over, and we'll paint the jamb first, flip it back over, and put some base coat on the door. All right, I got a fresh coat of primer on the door. We had to change plans a little bit because we didn't want to take the door with fresh primer, flip it over on top of sawhorses to do the jams. So we just moved the sawhorses in a little bit so I can get access to all the jams. But it's ready to spray color on. So then we'll talk a little bit about the paint. There's several different kinds of paint you can use. Alkyd enamels, acrylic enamels with urethane hardener, or in our case, we're going to actually use an acrylic urethane. There's also single stage paints and base coat clear coats, which we're going to use a base coat clear coat. If you're using a base coat clear coat, it's very important to remember that the color, the base coat, is nothing but color. It has no UV protection or anything. All it does is turn this thing, in this case, new Chianti red. So, just like with the torque specs and the engine assembly, you need a manual on the paint, no matter what type of paint it is, because that's going to tell you exactly how to mix it, which reducers to use for what temperatures, because the reducers are temperature specific. So in this case, we're going to use a medium reducer, and I look in my thing here, and it tells you how to mix it. Mixing ratio is 1:1, base coat to reducer. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up some paint, and we'll get ready to spray. All right, so we got the paint all mixed up. There's no induction time with paint or clear. It's just the primer that has the induction time. But we're mixed up, we're ready to go. Some of you purists out there might say, oh, you're using the same gun for paint and primer. And what I've found is if you're using a relatively inexpensive gun, by all means use the same gun. If you have a more expensive one that's costs you quite a bit to rebuild, then you might want to not run primer through it. The primer is a little bit abrasive on the tips and stuff, so you can, I mean, you'll wear guns out a little bit faster. But for me, I use the same gun for base coat, clear coat, and the primer. So I'm actually going to put the rest of my protective gear on, and we're going to turn this thing red. Okay, so there's the first coat on there. With metallics especially, 3 light coats is a lot better than 1 heavy coat. We're going to have to put at least 2 coats on this. You got to get coverage, and it just needs to be even all the way across. And we need to make sure you get all the little corners, because as you spray, if you're not pointed directly at this surface, it's not going to get a real good coat. So we're going to have to put at least 1 more coat on here, but looking in the manual here, it says you need 10 minutes between dry times. 5 to 10 minutes at 70 degrees, so we're going to let this set up a little bit, and then we'll come back and put another coat on it. We're ready to put the clear coat on, now that we've got the base all on there. And just like swimming, we had to wait 30 minutes before we could actually clear coat it. The base coat has to set up just a little bit before you can hit it with the clear. So we got it all set up, we're ready to do it. A couple things that you need to know when you're doing the clear coat, especially because it's your final coat. We're not in a very controlled environment, obviously. The better you can control your environment, the better the paint job's going to be. We're fully prepared when this thing is all done to wet sand it and buff it, because we know we're going to get a little dirt in it. We might get a bug in it. We might get a cotton seed in it. I mean, we don't know for sure what's going to happen. That's why paint booths are in body shops, you know, because then they can control the airflow going in. They can control what's in the booth. So we're going to get ready to spray clear on this thing. I've got it all mixed up in my gun. Put my sock on here, and we'll make it glossy. A couple things to remember when you're spraying anything. You want to use the gun, you want to make sure that you keep the gun about 6 inches away from the surface that you're spraying. And you want to make sure that you keep it at the proper angle. You don't want to be spraying like this or like this. You want to keep it perpendicular to the surface that you're spraying. That's going to give you your best coat. And when you spray, as you see the paint being, or the clear or the primer or anything, whatever being applied, you want to do about a 50% overlap, which means you want the center of that spray pattern right on the edge of that last coat that you just put on. And then one other thing that you always have to keep the gun moving. If you stop the gun in any one spot, you're going to get a run for sure. So if you do get a run, you can always wet sand, buff it out. I mean, it's not the end of the world. If you get a drip, if you get a water spot, I mean, all those things happen. The dirt, the bugs, they can all be sanded out. So we're going to put 2 more coats of clear on this, so we've got plenty of material on. You want to try and get a clear coat built to about 2.5 mils thickness, which is about 3 coats. So we're going to put 3 coats on this, so we got plenty of material to work with as far as wet sanding and buffing, and then that finish will look as good as the rest of the car.
Brent, I think there was something really important missing from this car when you found it.
Yep.
That thing that makes it go down the road.
Yep. Yeah, it was a rolling chassis when we got it, so no engine, no transmission, just pulled it up on the trailer.
Okay, because we wanted to start from scratch.
Yeah,
anyway.
we wanted to build a motor.
And so give us the lowdown. This came out of a what?
1986 Chevy pickup. It was a stock motor, you know, so I mean nothing spectacular. 4-bolt main is why we went with the pickup rather than finding a car or something. A little bit tougher. You can put a little bit more horsepower to it. And it ran when we pulled it out, but we had it, tore it all down, sent it to the machine shop, and had them. It was actually bored 40 over, and then they put new cam bearings in and put the new frost plugs, and I mean, just did, you know, the machine shop work to it.
Kind of basically make it really a new engine at this point.
Right.
And again, it's one of these things that, one of these forks in the road.
Right.
We talked about it a little bit earlier. You got to make some decisions when the engine goes in as far as what is it you want to do with the car. So again, back to this concept, daily driver,
Right.
want to pull up to
Pump
a standard gas pump
Right.
and fill the car up, not have to go to an airport to fill the car up.
Yeah.
So that was part of the decision-making process.
Right. And we're gonna dress it up obviously a little bit. We've got some Edelbrock parts we're gonna put on it. We're gonna put some chrome on there, and then these, I picked these up, just stainless steel bolt kits for this engine. They're short block Chevy bolt kits, so we can replace all the oil pan, all the header bolts, all the valve cover bolts, the water pump. I mean, all the bolts that go on the outside that you can see on the engine get replaced with stainless steel versus the other ones. Because they were getting, you know, I mean, they look kind of crappy. You know, 50 years of dirt. Well, I guess this was an 86, so 30 years of dirt and grime. But so we're gonna replace the bolts, put the intake on. We're probably waiting on the carburetor, but it looked cool, so we put it on the table.
And I think the bolts are a great point. It goes back to this idea of, you know, mainstream vehicle, pretty easy to find these parts, and you can see the way they all came in a kit like that. This is not the first time this is happening for people, you know. So the bolt kits are ready to go. Buy them off the shelf.
Chevy 350s, you can get parts. I mean, you can do anything to a Chevy 350 that you want to.
Very mainstream.
Yep.
So what we already got done is the pistons are in, the rings are
Yep.
in, the crankshaft is in, so that internal assembly of this engine is already complete, leaving for us really the external stuff: water pump, oil pump, fuel pump,
Yep.
oil pan.
Yeah, we'll just put the heads on, put the intake on, the oil pan, the oil pump's got to go in, the fuel pump, and then just basically get it ready so we can attach the new motor mounts and
Do
get
a
it
test fit.
set into place so we can actually weld the new motor mounts into place.
Cool. All right, well, that gives you the lowdown on the engine and where it came from. Well, Brent, we finally got a job where we get to start at the top of the engine, that is. So we're going to start here by getting the heads put onto the engine, and there's some stuff that we've got to specifically pay attention to, right, Doctor?
Yep, for sure. First thing, obviously you got to check over the head gasket. Very important, especially on a small block Chevy, that there's no creases or anything. It didn't get damaged in shipping, or you didn't, you know, drop it on your way into the shop. And then sometimes, this one doesn't make any difference, but sometimes they'll say this side up or this side toward engine or something like that. If it doesn't say, then it doesn't matter. If it can only go on one way, plenty good. These can go on either way, and it doesn't really make any difference. So we're going to put the head gasket on, and then we'll set the head in place.
See how I took the light part and he can do the heavy part?
Oh, baby. All right, so there's two little alignment pins there that the head sits on. Once you get those in place,
And we can just start with any old bolt, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, you can start with any
Throwing your
old
red
bolt.
herring there.
You can start with any old bolt, but when you go to actually tightening the bolts down, there's an actual specific sequence that you need to follow. But we can get all of them started.
And we do have a length differential here. We've got both the long and the short of
Yeah,
it.
there's 2 short ones here. There's 8 short ones down here, and then the longer ones, this is one of the short ones.
Yep. Now, and this is a case where hand tightening is going to be the starting point, and then we're going to end up with a torque wrench to finalize everything.
Yep, we got the torque wrench here. And now, when I say there's a specific sequence to tightening this,
How do you know that?
in the manual, this manual right here, an old motor manual for a 350, it tells you right here for a cylinder head tightening sequence, small V8 engines, which this would be considered a small block V8 engine. It tells you start in the center, and then basically you work out in a spiral pattern clockwise. So when we get that far, we'll start in the center, we'll snug them all down in that pattern, and then we'll switch over to the torque wrench. And then to check the torque, in the same manual, cylinder head, bolts, foot-pounds, V8 is 65 pounds. So we'll get those snug down, and then we'll switch over to the torque wrench, set it to 65 pounds, and tighten them right down.
All right, number one.
So, yep, start at number 1, we'll just snug it down. And then, yep, number 2, number 3, and just keep working around. Yep. Now we're going to be using the same clicker style torque wrench that we used to set the connecting rods and the main bearing caps. So there's different types. There's some with needles. The click type is by far the most accurate because it actually gives you an audible click when you hit the torque specified by the dial here. All right, so the same sequence. Start at number 1. There's our click. All right, that's it.
Should we repeat the process?
Do it again on the other side.
Second verse, same as the first. We'll wrap up this side and then we're ready to move on.
Okay, now we got the cylinder heads in place. They're all torqued down. The next step is going to be put lifters in, push rods in, and the rocker arm assemblies.
Well, here's what I think we have a great opportunity for, though, Brent,
All
is a little learning bit going on here because,
Okay.
you know, there's stuff going on inside the engine. This is riding on something. This is so. Just give us the once over on what's happening here because we have a great opportunity to talk about how engines work.
Okay. Down right underneath here that you can't see is the camshaft. The lifter actually rides on the camshaft, and there's a lobe that the camshaft pushes that lifter up and down, which is then attached to the push rod, comes through here, and as we get these things assembled, you'll see as that goes up and down, it goes onto a rocker arm assembly that opens and closes the valve. So as the camshaft turns, it's timed to the crankshaft through the timing chain that we put on earlier, and it opens the valve at the right time for the right cylinder to draw in the fuel charge, then compression, then fire, and then exhaust.
And one of the things that's cool that we were just talking about was the fact that these rods have a hole all the way down through the center, and then the lifters have a hole in the side of the body and a corresponding hole in the end. So what that does is it shoots oil up to the top of the engine.
Yep,
that's
how the
one of
top
the
end
things
gets oiled.
I can just never get over is how clever all this is. You know, it's pretty amazing all the engineering that has figured this stuff out and allows us to work.
Yep.
Like one of those?
Yep, and we need some assembly.
Oh, I had it a second ago.
grease there. We got to put
I'm
a
going to
little
let
bit.
you get your hands dirty. I got a date
That's
tonight.
nice. We got to put all that on there. And we'll just slip that down into the lifter hole. Okay, that goes in there. We'll put a little bit of that on there. That goes down through there. And then we just do that 16 times, and then we'll start putting rocker assemblies. Okay, and then there's a little half moon ball there that we got to put in there. So then that goes in.
Now,
And a bolt
we've
goes
talked a
on.
lot about tightening and torquing, and so we just got
Yep.
done looking this up. What's going to happen here? It's a
Well-
kind of a unique approach.
Yeah, you actually have to, on a Chevy 350, there's no torque, this era, there's no torque specs per se on the rocker assemblies. You actually have to have the engine running, and then you back it off until the lifter clatters a little bit, then you tighten it up till it stops clattering, and then you turn it a quarter turn.
It's
until-
all spelled out.
Yeah, it's all spelled out in the manual. So, but to get it started, we have to get it up to number 1. All we're going to do is put these on now and just snug them up a little bit. To get it started, we're going to need to get the piston up on number 1, so number 1 is firing. And then there's a specified, you can adjust exhaust valves 1, 3, 7, and 8, or I don't know what the numbers are, but you can adjust certain exhaust valves and certain intake valves, then you roll it over 180 degrees. So number 6 is up on firing, and you can adjust the rest up to where they're just snug. And then you have to do the final adjustments once it's running. So we'll just,
So the moral of the story is you got to have the spec book that we keep
Yeah, you
talking
gotta
about.
have the manual.
You got to follow it for your particular engine and make
So we'll
sure
just-
that you're doing this stuff
we'll just
the right
tighten
way.
these things up until there's no play in there, and that'll be close enough to get us together, and nothing's going to fall apart. So that's plenty good right there.
A few
for
more
now.
of those to go.
Yeah, just a few.
All right, we'll carry on and have this done in no time. Starting on the top of the engine here, working on the assembly. Heads are on, rockers are on, intake's next. What do we need to know?
Well, there's not much you need to know. We got the
I'm
gasket
good
set,
at
obviously. The gasket set obviously has to go on. And this is one of those we talked about a little bit earlier in the head gasket. If there's a way that it has to go on, the gasket will tell you, or it will only go on one way. This actually says, and I don't know if you can see it in the video here, this side up. So there's only one way
That's
that
a good indicator.
there's only one way that this gasket's going to go on there. So we put the Chevrolet, the short blocks here, or the 350s, are a 4-piece intake gasket. So you have the little rubber ends here that you have to put on. And then you actually have to take a little RTV, and I'll grab that. So once you get those in place, take a little RTV and put in all 4 corners where these gaskets meet the end gaskets. We'll just put a little. And you don't have to use a lot. Just want to make sure that seals up good. And then obviously you want to keep stuff as clean as possible anytime you're putting anything together, engine related. The cleaner the better.
Hospital clean.
Hospital clean. That's what my old shop teacher used to tell me. So once it's there, it's all set in place. And then we take the intake and very, very, very carefully, so you don't disturb those gaskets, set it down into place.
Now we're starting with these
Yep.
stainless steel bolts that came in that packaging that we showed you earlier.
And then we also checked the manual again for the tightening sequence on the intake and the torque specs. So we've got that. And you definitely want to check the manual because there's always a right way and a wrong way. Or a different way that might not work. And these 4 here we're not going to torque because we're going to have to actually use those 4 to attach the engine hoist to. So we're just going to start those. And they're the last 4 that get torqued on this. It's similar to the head. When you tighten it, you start with this one as number 1, and you make a circular pattern going out. So we're going to leave these 4 loose so we can attach the engine hoist to it. All right, so we're just going to use a gear wrench here to snug them down a little bit, and then I'll grab the torque wrench set to the proper torque setting, and then we'll torque them down.
Preset, correct?
Preset, yep. Starting with that one. And this is the way this thing is designed, this intake. It's really, really tight in there to get the torque wrench in, so we actually had to use a universal on there. And we'll take that off. As soon as we get those 4 inside ones off, we'll take that universal off to get the outside ones. Gotta be close. There she went. Now we're using Edelbrock parts and...
Listening for the click.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Okay, now we're using Edelbrock parts, and you know, there's a lot of different aftermarket performance parts out there. Edelbrock is just one of the many. I can't say that it's better than any other ones. This just happens to be the one that was on the shelf at the parts store where I get all my parts from. So this is what we decided to use. They have a fine reputation, so I think it'll actually perform really, really well for us. All right, and we're going to leave those loose because we got to put the engine hoist on there. We'll throw the valve covers on.
Get those pretty valve covers.
Yeah, and we're going to throw the valve covers on. Obviously, they have to come back off again because we have to reset the valves when we get that far. But we want to protect the rocker assemblies just in case something happens when we're putting this thing in. So we've got valve covers, valve cover gaskets, and then we're using wing nuts to put them on rather than using the... so then we don't need any tools when we have to take these things back off again. And when we get...
And they look cool.
They do look very cool. And when we get to the point where we're putting this whole thing together, there's wire stands that go on here as well, but we'll talk about that later. So we're just going to spin these on.
Well, Brent, the engine really looks good. And with the performance parts we've added, it's going to run great as well. This takes care of the intake and our valve covers going on here. And we're set with this step in the assembly.
Yeah, we're done on top. Now we're just going to roll it over, finish up the bottom, and then this is actually ready to get mated up to a transmission. And then we'll put it into the car and get the new motor mount set.
Very cool. We're to a point now on the bottom of the engine where we can do oil-related stuff. So you got an oil pump over there, Brent. I think that's an important part of the oil system.
Very important part. This is a high volume, high pressure oil pump.
It sounds pretty loud, that volume.
One of the keys with these things, getting this pickup tube into these oil pumps is a bit of a challenge.
You did a great trick, and I think it's similar to what I saw you do once where you were slipping a gear on for timing,
Yep.
where you expanded the gear but not the shaft
Right.
to make the gear get bigger. Similar concept here. Tell the folks at home how you solved this problem. It's very smart.
Physics. That's the one word answer. But anyway, we take the pickup tube, put it in the freezer, leave that in overnight, and then put the oil pump itself into the oven, warm it good, and then get them started good together, and then you can actually press them
So
together.
the cold stuff shrinks, the warm stuff expands.
And it's a really tight fit. They do not want this pickup tube coming off the oil pump. That would be a very, very bad
And it's a press
day.
fit, so it's
Yep.
something you've got to overcome
Yep.
for your system in your shop with your tools.
And
Brent's
you
idea was a great
and you
one.
don't want to beat on it with a hammer because you will collapse the tube, or you could, you could definitely do a lot of damage to it. So you got to be very, very careful putting these together, and it can be very difficult.
But it's together,
This is together.
ready to install.
Yep. Another important part you don't want to forget.
Doesn't work very well without that
No,
shaft.
it won't run with that. That's your distributor shaft. So that actually snaps into the oil pump. And then we feed that down through there. And it's just one bolt that holds that in place. Okay, so the oil pump is in. We're ready to put the pan on. Okay, so the gaskets go in place. And there's only one way they can go because there's a dipstick tube there.
Quit it.
And then same with the oil pan. It's a 4-piece gasket, so you have to put a little bit of RTV in the corners. The trick now is to put this on without getting it all fingerprinted, because it's pretty nice. You can see yourself in there, George. We'll have to move those.
Yeah, go ahead. We'll get it as we go. And we're back to our stainless
steel.
bolts that
Yep.
came out of that package. Hugely convenient way to do this.
And then there's 4 bolts that are bigger. They go on the ends, but I mean, obviously you'd figure that out.
On this last bolt, it's having a hard time going in because we got a little bit of an alignment issue. Brent, I believe you want to give me a punch to help with that.
Yeah, a lot of
That's
times,
the punch I meant, actually.
a lot of times you need something to help you line the gasket up and get the holes lined up. And this one just happens to be being a little bit.
You think that was probably the
Difficult.
silver bullet answer right there. Look at you.
Hey, nothing to it. So now go ahead and torque these. Like I say, there's no sequence to it. There's no real torque spec. You just want to get them tight enough, obviously, so it doesn't leak. You don't want to get them so tight that you twist off the bolt.
That takes care of getting in the oil pump, the oil pan. Did a nice job on this. You want to reflect on it for a little while?
I do.
All right.
Actually, I want to clean it.
Yeah, I know, it's killing you. Looks great, and we're done with this step. Are you pumped?
I'm pumped.
Pumped for pumps?
Pumped.
Next thing we want to do are the fuel pump and the water pump, and that's going to really go a long way toward wrapping up our work here on the engine. Fuel pump first, Brent, so give us a lowdown. We've got a shaft here someplace.
Yep. We got to have very, very important part is the fuel pump drive rod. The way this thing works is it slides down into there, it rides on the cam, a cam lobe, moves up and down, pushing that, and that's what makes the fuel pump pump. So we got to put that in first. Take a little bit of assembly lube.
Now, one of the things that Brent and I have learned the hard way is that you can make this a little bit easier, a little bit harder.
Way easier.
Of course, there's a lobe in there. So depending on the position of the lobe, that affects the position of that shaft. The more it's projecting out, the more it pushes on the bottom of the fuel pump.
As this is in there, that lobe is pushing this way.
And that's spring loaded.
And that's spring loaded. So to get this, if this lobe is all the way up, we're going to push on this, we won't be able to line the bolts up. So what we want to do is make sure, just turn that engine over and make sure that
It's not going to start, is it?
I don't think so.
It's like my old tractor. This is how I started it.
So that it's going down. All right, right there is the lowest point on the cam lobe. So that's where we want to put this in, finish putting this thing together. So we need the plate.
And all I'm going to do to help on the alignment of the next step is finger tighten these so that we have some wiggle room on that plate, because there's some adjustability there. So we want to make it easy to get those upper bolts in. It's all you.
Okay.
All right, let's do-si-do a little bit so we can get a good look at the front for the water pump.
All right, and that's a pretty darn easy one. 4 bolts, 2 gaskets, 1 water pump. Now sometimes there's things that get attached to water pumps on these bolts. This particular case, there is not. So we're just going to put that in. Maybe.
Now, before we walk away, I hate to be obsessive compulsive, but this is killing me. So
Well,
they'll pop off,
They just pop off and you straighten them out.
and we can realign them so that the
I think.
heads are back in line with the valve cover itself, and it just looks a little cooler.
Yep.
All right, pumps look great, gasketed, good to go. We got fuel, we got water.
We're ready to put a transmission on the back, slip it in the car, and get those motor mounts
That is going to
lined
be
up.
way cool.
The next step on our little project here is we're going to actually locate some new motor mounts. We're putting side motor mounts in along with the cross member on the transmission. Originally, this engine was mounted here, and then it's hard to see back here, but there's a couple mounts for the transmission there. We're actually replacing them with side mount, engine mounts, and a cross member on the very back of the transmission. So the instructions that came with the motor mounts say these are going to be installed right there. We just want to take a couple minutes. We're going to actually move the engine and transmission into place. I'm going to get George in here to help me. And we're just going to make sure that everything looks right. I mean, make sure we got the right mounts. Make sure everything just seems like it's going to be in the right spot if we do weld those things in. Because once I weld them in, it's going to be awfully tough to change it. So I'm going to get George in here. We're going to roll this engine into place, and we're going to start locating these mounts for it.
All right, we're working on different planes here. We've got a leveler on the lift, and we'll use that to get the engine and the transmission at just the right angle. At the same time, we're going to get to a point where we've got to drop the engine, which I think we're ready for now, gently. So it's a little bit needle threading. Sure is nice having the radiator and the other front end components off though. All right, the oil pan's real close to the frame.
Okay.
sounds like a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Down a skosh. Now what's going to happen eventually is Brent is going to go underneath with a jack and he'll lift the transmission from underneath. And that's what that's going to help us locate that other cross member.
Now I'm going to grab that motor mount.
All right, so basically what we're looking for here is, can the motor mount go into that position that Brent showed you earlier on the frame? Can we align with,
Up a little bit on this.
with the motor mount that's on the engine? And are we maintaining the clearance we need? Remember, we got to get a distributor in there in a little bit later. So we got to, all those stars have to align.
Okay, so right there is where they say it should be.
And
that's, okay,
there we go. So Brent's holding it in the right position. The engine mount and the body mount are now aligned on Brent's side.
and there's plenty of room in back. So that's where they say to put it. So we've got the right motor mounts for this frame.
Brent, you did a great job getting those welded in. Yes, very nice. Pat yourself on the back. Now, one of the things that's important there, Brent is a really good welder, and he used a really good welder. We want to just make sure that if you're not at all comfortable with welding, if there's any question, don't hesitate to job that out to somebody else.
Very important. Don't use a 110 volt welder on 1/4 inch plate steel. You're just not going to get it hot enough. You got to use something that can generate a lot of heat in order to melt that in there. That's not a component that you want to fall out. Now the manufacturer did actually, there are bolt holes there that you could bolt it in, but it said for added strength, weld it in. So we just went right ahead and welded it in right off the bat.
And it seemed like the bolts would be a little
They'd be tough to get in. Yeah, they'd be tough to get in. A lot harder than welding it in. If you've got the equipment.
Now that we've got those in, and of course we've already got the mounts on the engine, we're going to do this again. We're going to get everything in place, and almost nearly for the last time here. We're getting dangerously close to being set here.
Yeah.
And once the engine is pinned, then what's going to happen with this cross member?
This is the new cross member for this particular, when you buy a cross member, it's going to be specific to, this one happens to fit a Turbo 350, which this is a Turbo 400, a TH700R. So it fits different ones, but it definitely has to be specific to the vehicle that you're putting it into. So what we're going to do, we're going to put the engine back into place. We'll put the bolts in the motor mounts, bolt this cross member in place, and then basically do the same thing that we did with the motor mounts, locate the brackets that get welded onto the frame that actually hold this cross member. So that's the next step. Now we got a little bit more in the way here, obviously, with these motor mounts, so we got to be a little bit careful with those. And my toes. Now if you don't have an engine leveling hoist like this, at this point you want to just put a rolling jack underneath the back of the transmission and start picking it up.
That's cool.
There's one. All right, just shake it a little. There we go. There it's in. There it's in.
So now we're pinned on both sides. Now you got to go underneath, right, with the floor jack.
We'll go underneath with the floor jack and jack the back of the transmission up, and then we can actually take this down, get all the pressure off of it, and just start lining up that back cross member.
That cross member. Cool. Brent's under the car. Hopefully he's not taking a nap. Are you awake under there, Brent? Make some noise.
I'm
Right.
okay. I'm good.
He's going to get a floor jack underneath the transmission, start to raise the transmission. As he does that, I'll be able to lower on this end. Now, we're working right off the floor, moving the transmission only, so no jack stands. We haven't raised the car.
Sorry.
I'm talking here, man. We haven't raised the car at all, so no jack stands. We don't have any concerns about that. All we want to do is get the transmission in place so he can get the cross member in place so he can mark it and we know where it goes. What do you need from me, man?
You can go ahead and let that down so we can get it leveled up. Take all the pressure right off it, put all the pressure on those motor mounts. So, now I'm going to take the cross member here and bolt it up to the tranny. Now we're just going to take these angle iron pieces and they'll wind up right there. We'll do a little bit of measuring, clean that up. We'll have to move the fuel line and the brake line out of the way, and then we'll actually take a die grinder or a wire
grinder.
brush with an angle grinder and clean that all up, get it marked and welded into place.
Well, that takes care of our motor mounts here on the front, the transmission mount on the cross member back there. Stay awake, Brent, we're almost done. That gets the engine and the transmission mounted in the frame. Again, to revisit this, we've got brackets that we ordered specific to this vehicle to carry this engine and this transmission. A little bit of monkeying around on our part, but for the most part, getting the task-specific parts makes this a pretty simple installation process.
Well, the next little project we're going to work on the 56 here is getting this old tattered, tore up headliner out of the way. There's a couple steps you need to follow. When you're doing it, you want to try and keep these bows, well, you want to keep these bows in the exact same spot where they came out of, just in case there's some differences in the front to the back is going to be different dimensionally. So you want to keep those in the same spot. So what I'm going to do is start in the front. It's stapled to a tack strip up there. I'm just going to start peeling it back, and then we'll take those bows out and I'll hand them to George on the other side here. And I'm going to put a mask on because there's probably 60, 70, or 60-year-old dust up there anyway. And I don't know what they had back then. So I'm going to mask up and I'm going to start peeling this thing out of here. So. That just gets pried back that way.
Number one.
There's number one. On this side over here, you can see there's these little triangle cutouts here. When we go to put the new one in, that's actually there's little triangular teeth there that actually grip the new headliner on the sides above the door openings. Otherwise, the rest of it gets all stapled into place when we get that far. So we'll keep tearing it out. Now there's still some staples and stuff here that we need to pull out. And I need to get this stuff all pulled out from behind here, which, as you can see here, there's screws that just hold that tack strip into place. So I'm going to have to take those screws out, pull the tack strip off, get all this old fabric out of here, and then pull those staples out. But before I do that, I'm going to go get George started and make sure he's getting those bows in the right place. How's it going, George?
It's good. What I'm doing here is I'm cleaning up the bows, because what's going to happen is we have to be able to slip the bows into what are called the listings of the headliner. So looking at the headliner here, these loops across the top, and they're bigger than the bows, but not a lot bigger than the bows. So if we leave this rust and junk on here, it's just that much harder to slide them in. And then additionally, as we tension the headliner, it's difficult to slide it over the bows to get it
to get the wrinkles and
get all the
out.
wrinkles out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean these up. I've kept them here in the reverse order. You handed them to me, right?
Yeah.
No, I've laid them here on the headliner in the order in which you gave to me. So we've got front to back, because they are, you can just tell looking at them, they're size specific, location specific. The other thing we're doing, of course, is in our dirty auto garage here, laid a sheet down on the floor and the headliner on the sheet to protect the headliner. But what's the bad news about the process, Brent?
There's a lot involved. No question, there's a lot involved. It takes quite a bit of time to do it. I mean, to get it to look right, it's going to take quite a bit of time. So we're not going to get to the installation today, but we are going to get this thing all cleaned up. I'm going to finish cleaning up the tack strips and get those all the rest of the fabric down out of there.
Which works good, because you're a tacky kind of a guy.
One thing to mention too, you can replace these bows if you don't want to take the time to clean them up. at a cost, of course.
And because we're not going to get to this for a little bit, I've got the masking tape here, and I'm going to label each of the bows so that we can keep track of what's the front, what's the back, and what order they go in. And we'll come back another time, and we'll have the opportunity to show you the install.
Do the install.
I don't think I'm going to have to talk much to convince you that this is a great case of out with the old and in with the new. Here's some of the old wiring that came out of this car, and you can see what a rat's nest we've got here. Even when it was still installed, it wasn't in great shape. As we rebuild everything here and put it back together, we want it to be bigger, better, faster, stronger. So we've got a whole new wiring system here, and it includes a fuse panel that accepts the new style of fuses. It's got significantly greater number of ports here that we can connect stuff to. Now here's the thing that you got to keep in mind. This is specific to this vehicle, just like if you order one, it'll be specific to your vehicle. So one of the things that's great about that is that this is sized, including its mounting plate, to go right up here under the dash and fit right where the old one was. Now the way this is going to work is that from the outside of the firewall, we're going to get a screw in here, a bolt. We're going to follow the recipe given in the directions. We're going to create a standoff to get that plate in just the right spot. Once that's on, we'll be able to get the fuse panel itself on. So I'm going to do that work, and then we're going to come back and look at some more benefits of getting this pre-cooked wiring harness and how easy it makes it to get everything wired back into the dash. The fuse panel is in, and follow the recipe to get that mounted just right. Again, there are directions there that include how to get the standoff off the firewall that makes everything work with this particular vehicle. Now, speaking of directions, we've got schematics for the wiring, came with the wiring harness, so we're going to plan our work and work our plan to make sure we get everything wired correctly. Now, let me just give you a few examples of how simple this really is. We've already sent the wires to the back of the vehicle, and they're here. They go down through the rocker panel. So just to get them out here where you can see them, this is the lead that comes off of the fuse panel. Here's the lead that goes back to the back of the vehicle. When we're ready, all we have to do is plug those in. Now, one of the things you can see is that the plugs distinctly fit each other. That's handy. So I almost can't screw this up because I can't get it to go into one of the other plugs. Additionally, as a visual reference, when we look at this, the colors of wires all line up as well. So as I work from the outside in, I can see that when I plug these two together, they're all going to line up color by color. This is actually going to live over here someplace when we're all done, so I'm not ready to connect that just yet. Now, as another example, let's look at some in-dash switches. In this case, this is our headlight switch. That's going to get put in place up here on the dash. Once that's in, then we'll come back to our assortment of wires, sort through until we find the right one. From underneath, we'll be able to simply plug that into the bottom of the switch and we're good to go. Now, in some cases, what you'll find is that you do have leads that are open on the end. That's because we cover a span of years with these wiring harnesses, and the final termination to the switch or whatever the connection is could be different within that range of years from vehicle to vehicle. So you might have to supply different kinds of connectors on some of these leads in order to make everything work. In some cases, too, you'll have to crimp the connections once they're in place. Again, just follow the recipe, follow the instructions that come with your kit. You'll get everything just fine. Once we're up into the dash with this stuff, going to use zip ties to hold it in place, in addition to the brackets that are in the dash designed to hold the wiring. Then as a final step, just like was originally done on the vehicle, we're going to use friction tape. You can see a little bit of that here on the wiring that we sent to the back of the vehicle. The friction tape binds everything together and helps protect the wiring as well. That's all about the inside of the car. Doesn't stop there, because once we grab the right package, we've got another set of wires that are specific to the engine compartment, so we'll be able to use these to work from the firewall forward, get everything set up under the hood. So really, it's a very simple system, a little bit fussy to get the wires in place. Do your best to keep everything neat, And you'll find that these wiring harnesses, following the directions, pretty darn easy to install. Brent, it's hard to beat the ease of work that these aftermarket catalog orderable parts bring to working on a car like this.
Yeah, the manufacturers, they're doing a really, really good job, especially on a 55, 56, 57 Chevys as far as fitting. And then the appearance, man, I tell you what, just you take an old pitted piece of chrome and put a brand new piece on there, really, really dresses it up.
Made our jobs a lot easier.
Oh, yeah.
Which isn't to say we didn't work hard, but, well,
I
I did
did.
anyway. All right. Well, showed you a lot of stuff. Had a blast showing you. Hope you had a blast watching it, and we're done for the day.